When most people hear the word Philistine, they probably think of one person, Goliath, a giant warrior standing in the valley of Elah, challenging the armies of Israel, while a young shepherd named David walks out to face him with a sling and 5 stones. But Goliath was only one Philistine. And by the time that David met him, the Philistines had already been one of Israel's greatest enemies for generations. They fought against Samson. They captured the Ark of the Covenant. They dominated parts of Israel during the days of Samuel. They fought Saul throughout his entire reign, and eventually, they killed him. But who exactly were these people? Because unlike many of Israel's enemies, the Philistines may not originally have been from Canaan at all. They may have come from across the sea. Around 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean entered one of the most chaotic periods in ancient history. The Great Bronze Age civilizations that had dominated the region began collapsing. Cities were burning, trade networks completely disappeared, the Hittite Empire had vanished, the Mycenaean palace civilization in Greece collapsed, Ugarit was destroyed and never rebuilt. Egypt survived Yahweh's humbling judgment upon its gods, but just barely. And Egyptian records describe groups of migrating peoples moving through the Eastern Mediterranean during this period. Modern scholars usually call them the Sea Peoples. Now that name can make them sound like a single nation or an empire. They weren't. The Sea Peoples appear to have been several different groups caught up in the migrations, the wars, and the social collapse at the end of the Bronze Age. Egyptian texts name groups like the Shurden, Shekelesh, Dinyan, Jeker, and one group called the Peliset. And most scholars identify the Egyptian Peliset with the people that the Bible calls the Philistines. Around 1177 BC, Pharaoh Ramses III claimed that he had defeated a coalition that included the Peliset in battles fought both on land and at sea. Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu depict warriors and migrating populations caught up in these conflicts, and it was sometime during this turbulent and chaotic warring period that a new culture began appearing along the southern coast of Canaan. We call that culture Philistine. Interestingly, the Bible also remembers the Philistines as people who came from somewhere else. Deuteronomy 2:23 describes a group called the Caphtorites coming from Caphtor, destroying the people who had previously lived near Gaza and settling in their place. Centuries later, the prophet Amos says something even more explicit. He says, "Did I not bring up Israel from the land of Egypt and the Philistines from Caphtor?" Jeremiah likewise calls the Philistines the remnant of the coastland of Caphtor. So Caphtor has traditionally been associated with Crete, or at least with the broader Aegean world. And that makes the archaeological evidence pretty fascinating because when the Philistines appear in Canaan, parts of their material culture showed connections with the Aegean world. Their pottery shows strong similarities to pottery traditions of the Mycenaean sphere. Their food practices and other cultural remains also distinguish early Philistine communities from some of their Canaanite neighbors. And then, in 2019, researchers published DNA results from ancient individuals buried in Ashkelon, one of the 5 capital cities of ancient Philistia. The study found that around the beginning of the Iron Age, the same general period in which the Philistine culture first appears, people with a measurable European-related genetic component appear in Ashkelon. The genetic signal was then rapidly diluted as newcomers mixed with the local Levantine population. So the Philistines were probably not simply an army that sailed into Canaan, conquered 5 cities, and remained genetically and culturally separate forever. Something much more complicated than that happened. People moved into the region from somewhere across the Mediterranean. They settled among existing populations, they mixed with them, and over time they created a new people whose culture contained both Mediterranean and Levantine elements. The Bible calls this group the Philistines. Now, Philistine power became centered around 5 major cities along the southern coastal plain: Gaza, Ashkelon, which is where the DNA testing occurred in 2019, Ashdod, Gath, the home of Goliath, and Ekron. And Joshua 13 calls these cities territories of the 5 lords of the Philistines. So Philistia was not necessarily a single centralized kingdom with one Philistine king sitting on a throne, but with 5 Philistine rulers cooperating with one another from their various territories. Together, these cities controlled valuable agricultural land and important trade routes along the Mediterranean coast. And geographically, they sat directly beside Israel. And so that made conflict almost inevitable. Israel occupied much of the hill country, the Philistines occupied the coastal plain, and between them were the foothills, places like the Valley of Sorek, the Valley of Elah, the very landscapes where the stories of Samson and David unfold. As such, the Israelite and Philistine wars were battles for the frontier between the two peoples. But while everything so far has given us the historical reason that the Philistines were in Canaan, the Judges gives us the theological explanation for why the Philistines were there. Judges 3 begins, "These are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel by them." And among the very first listed are the 5 lords of the Philistines. So the text gives us 2 closely related purposes. First, these peoples remained so that later generations of Israel would learn war. The generation that entered Canaan would eventually die. Their children and grandchildren had not seen the battles of conquest. They needed to learn that possessing the land required courage, vigilance, and dependence upon Yahweh. But verse 4 goes even deeper. The nations were there to test Israel to know whether they would obey the commandments of the Lord. The Philistines, therefore, became more than just some other enemy. They became a test. Would Israel trust Yahweh? Would Israel obey the covenant? Would Israel remain distinct from the nations? Or would Israel become like the nations around them? And almost immediately, Israel fails again and again and again. By Judges 13, God hands Israel over to the Philistines for 40 years. The cycle of oppression and deliverance occurs for generations until eventually God raises up Samson, who has the iconic moment where he pulls the temple of Dagon down upon the heads of the Philistine leaders. But that was not the end of the Philistines. By the time of 1 Samuel, we're told that the Philistines had gained enough economic and military control that Israel did not even have its own blacksmiths capable of producing weapons. Israelites had to go down to the Philistines simply to have agricultural tools sharpened. Even after Samson's deadly blow to Philistia, Israel was still being held under the thumb of the Philistines. The people whom God had left in the land to test Israel had become one of the greatest threats to Israel's existence. Eventually, Israel would demand a king. One of that king's primary responsibilities would be defeating these enemies. God tells Samuel that Saul is to be anointed so that he shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines. That was part of Saul's calling from the very beginning, but Saul would never finish the mission. A shepherd from Bethlehem would instead. A man whose first great public victory came when he walked into the valley of Elah, faced a Philistine champion from the city of Gath, and declared that the battle belonged to Yahweh. Of course, his name was David. And before we talk about David's war against the Philistines, we need to understand something else about them, their gods. Because when Israel and Philistia went to war, the ancient world understood something much larger to be happening. It wasn't simply Israel against Philistia, it was Yahweh, God of Israel, against the gods of the Philistines. And standing at the center of that conflict was a god named Dagon.